Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hyatt, and honored today to be joined by Mike Lenox of University of Virginia Darden School of Business, where he's the Taylor Murphy Professor of Business Administration and also teaches the core MBA and MBA elective of Strategy in a Digital Age. And as part of our summer read series, we invited Mike on to talk about his new book and give us some perspective in terms of how organizations are approaching digital transformation. And of course, Mike, I have to say it, in the age of AI.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, so you've written a lot about decarbonization and the environmental impact of business and how those two can coexist. What was the line from that line of research to where we're looking at digital transformation today?
Yeah, I think core to my academic interest, my research and my teaching has always been around technological change, right? And what we often refer to as disruption these days. When do new technologies come around and disrupt the status quo? So you see that in my work around decarbonization and what's happening in the kind of what we call the clean energy sector. But obviously what's happening with AI and digital is another one of these kind of major trends that is something I've kind of long been interested in.
And there's not to say that there isn't a direct link between the two, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we talk. So with all the talk of digital transformation, I mean, from my lifespan, the first transformation was from paper to digital. And then we went from on-prem to the cloud. What is the latest digital transformation kind of macro trend that executives are starting to take advantage of and should really be investing in more heavily?
Well, I like the fact that you kind of highlighted that this has been a long journey, right? This is a trend that goes back 50, 60 years at this point. And we've seen this evolution of digital technologies, whether it's, personal computing to mobile computing, the rise of the internet as we know it. Clearly, the item of the moment is AI. But I always point out, I was a systems engineering student back in the early 1990s. And back in that time period, I was learning things like neural networks, machine learning, basically the building blocks of AI. The challenges we had were twofold. One, we didn't have the processing power we have today. And two, we just didn't have the volume of data to train our algorithms on that we're seeing. And so, as we often see with technology, when we think about S-curves, there was a long period of gestation with AI where it just never seemed to be quite taking hold. And I think what we've seen, especially with the rise of generative AI and OpenAI with their ChatGPT product, is we're getting to that sweet spot of the S-curve where we're seeing massive improvements over a short period of time. And it's obviously captured the public imagination now in ways that it just hadn't over the last 40 years or so.
And I'll get the obligatory quotes out of the way is the old joke used to be, AI is whatever form of technology wasn't working. That right. If it was AI, it didn't work. And then as we've heard kind of used more recently in the press is slowly then quickly. And right. I think that, but you frame it in the S-curve, which as a strategy podcast, we always appreciate those frameworks, a long gestation period. And those long gestation periods can, I think, create a false sense of security among executives and IT leaders, and that it's natural to want to resist that change when that inflection point occurs. What has your research told you?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And I think you highlighted what a fun thing I always like to say is disruption never seems like it's going to occur until it does, right? And so we look at these technologies, they often have these, and sometimes decades long gestation periods, and it just seems like they're never going to come about. Right. And then suddenly it does. Right. And it's never guaranteed. I always tell my students if I could predict technology trends perfectly, I'd probably be living on an island that I own for making these good forecasts. So it's very hard to do. But there are patterns. And a lot of my work is about looking at those patterns. So one of the things we look for is there a coalition around what we call dominant design? Are we seeing like a particular way that the technology is manifesting? I think that's what we're seeing right now with generative AI about how we train these large language models. We're kind of getting some agreement that this is probably the best way to approach this. The second thing you see from a more market standpoint is just diffusion, right? That we start to see adoption out there in the marketplace. We see entry. We see lots of different companies entering into the market. And my one bold prediction I like to make with AI, which I don't think is that bold, is we'll see a shakeout. This happens invariably when we have a disruptive technology come about. There'll be massive entry by a lot of different companies, and most of them are going to fail. Or at the very least, they're going to merge together at some point, and we'll have far fewer players there. So my bold prediction is probably in the next year or so, we're going to see a massive disruption and shakeout of the AI companies. And there'll be people saying, oh, see, this whole AI thing was overblown and it's not really disruptive here. The parallel I hear, sometimes people say this will be just like the dot-com bust. And my retort to that is like, you're right. That internet thing, it never really took off, did it? It never really was that.
Yeah, flash in the pan was the word I would use.
Flash in the pan. We did it for a little while in the 90s, and then it just kind of went away.
Right.
So I think it's going to be the same thing with AI. It's overhyped. There will be a shakeout. But the underlying trend is there that this is going to be a pretty fundamental disruptive technology.
I agree. And if I go back to that .com boom, right, just because you put a .com after the name
Right.
of your business, that afforded you a certain valuation at a certain period of time. And the parallel I see today is just because you have a chatbot in the corner of your screen, then all of a sudden you're some sort of AI technology. But in reality, these are just wrappers around a core fundamental technology. And I always ask students as they think of AI startups is, what is the risk that your product becomes a feature of an LLM? And it's pretty high, is my experience.
No, that's exactly right. I think you have to look like where in the value chain these startups are positioning themselves. Clearly there's an upstream piece of this that NVIDIA has done very well of designing the advanced graphical processor units, the advanced chips to kind of power some of these AI. So that's a whole world into itself on chip design. Even further upstream, chip manufacturing, the machines, the photolithography machines that make these chips. There's a whole bunch of potential, innovations there. Then you have the training of the big LLMs. And I think there's a really interesting question about how much data and processing power is required to create one of these LLMs. If the answer is a lot, then I think what's going to happen is we're only going to have a handful of companies who really provide those baseline models, whether it's Amazon or OpenAI or Microsoft and the like. And then everyone else will be then taking these base models and then training them maybe on specific applications using proprietary data that they have. But they're going to be very reliant on those big LLM base model providers. Now, open questions. DeepSeek kind of caused the big disruption in the market there briefly because of this idea that, hey, maybe it doesn't require a whole bunch of processors training your algorithm on the internet like OpenAI did to get an effective LLM. And I think the answer is still out there and we don't quite know it yet. Some have questioned whether DeepSeek really was starting from scratch or whether it basically just took OpenAI and just kind of added a little bit, more to it. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about what that future is going to look like.
Or as we say, steal like an artist. But we'll leave that to people who's with a little higher pay grade to make those decisions. I love how you laid out the value chain, and I lay it out as the inputs, the chips, the models, the output. And
yep.
Anyone listening to this podcast is not playing in the chip space, as you said, NVIDIA, ASML. That's now being played out at a geopolitical level because the implications really are that big. I also like the fact that you emphasize that the value isn't in the model. We know I think that DeepSeek is an interesting challenger. At the end of the day, I'd be interested in your perspective from a business professor is, do the laws of scaling apply to LLMs? Will they become a commodity, right? Is this where the standard frameworks will play out? Or dare I say the dreaded words, is it different this time?
Yeah. No, and I think again, this idea of scale is really important. We're already seeing that like Amazon through AWS is offering advanced AI techniques and algorithms available to you. So that's why a lot of people believe that, it's going to be about data. Like who has interesting, unique proprietary data to train their algorithms that others can't replicate. And so I think that's kind of the future that a lot of people see. And the question is, where does that data reside, and does it really provide, a value over the base LLM that might be created?
Hugely important. And my follow up to that is, as we understand, published research is predicting that human generated content of any value will be extinguished by 2026, give or take a few months, right? But we can say that within the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to hit a rate limiting factor. And so I guess the question becomes is how are companies playing in this space? And if I'm an executive, how do I know that I have data that's of value?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the core issue is going to come down for any variety of applications and industries, productivity gains, like true productivity gains. And we've seen with digital technology, whether it was the personal computer or whether it was the rise of the internet, that it took a while, like decades, before we saw real productivity gains. I think we're going to have a similar phenomenon here where whether you're really getting labor substitution by using these LLMs or more broadly AI, it might take some time. Clearly, we've seen quite a bit of automation in manufacturing. That trend continues. That's a trend that goes back 50 plus years. The difference this time is that historically, let's say it's robotics, we're training the robotics to do a very particular task by just basically coding it, right? Like telling it move from point A to point B. With these AI techniques, we're teaching the robots basically to teach themselves by leveraging the data available to them. And so we're making some great progress on what seem to be really hard problems, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's, your humanoid robot who's going to fold your laundry for you. And so that's kind of very interesting in kind of the physical world. And then in the more service-oriented world and digital world, using similar techniques to do higher ordered intellectual work, whether it's legal summaries or I always talk about dermatologists using AI to forecast whether a mole is likely to be cancerous. So I think those possibilities are there, but it's going to take a while before it really gets ingrained. I've started to do some research on dermatology, and it's interesting. We're seeing adoption, but we're not seeing yet a change in the kind of organizational structure. So in other words, if the idea is this is going to make dermatologists more productive to have these tools, we would assume at some level, lower number of dermatologists, higher productivity, fewer, using the technology. We're not seeing that yet. And I think it might take a while for that to play itself out. Every single sector, I think, is going to have a similar, path here.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back, everyone, to our conversation with Mike Lenox. This is fast, it's furious, but I can tell you that what we're covering is central to the conversation, not necessarily about AI as much as it is to the realities facing industries and the need to continue to invest in digital transformation, as he talks about in his new book, Strategy in a Digital Age. Mike, we talked so much about the compute power, the LLMs, the data, and the potential use cases like manufacturing. But you started to touch on some of the challenges facing higher order tasks like knowledge work. You gave a great example kind of the dermatologist. You famously said kind of no one wakes up wanting more technology. How does that, the human side, play into what is clearly a technological or digital trend.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'm not one who subscribes to the jobless future as a result of AI, though I do think it will be quite disruptive and both societally and technologically. I do think it will increase again productivity, and that ultimately should lead to kind of restructuring of some industries. So what I often talk about is things like consulting and legal work, where you typically have a pyramid model where you have a lot of junior associates who are brought in, dare I say, to do the grunt work. That grunt work's being automated, right? Like right now, all of those types of companies are trying to figure out how they can use the AI technology to do some of that work. Ultimately, that's going to change the way they approach their work. I think you'll have fewer of those junior associates. That pyramid, the base of it will shrink. Even change the way they think about personal development, right? These companies are built on up and out models where, vast majority of people don't make it to partner level, and that's part of the rigor of how you get there. They might have to think about, no, now we're going to have more of a ladder model where we want everyone we bring in to kind of make it to partner someday and have a fewer number of people. And again, leveraging the technology. But that takes time, right? Some of these are just norms that organizations and businesses have developed, and it's very hard for them to break out of those kind of mental models to see how the technology might actually transform the nature of work in their particular industry.
I appreciate you saying that. And when people ask me what jobs are most at risk, I don't look at it as specific industries. I look at it across as people. And the first cohort, if you will, that is probably at greatest risk is that 22 to 25-year-old coming out of undergrad. And again, when you try deep research or any of these deeper analytical functions these LLMs are rolling out, I would be concerned.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, again, that the spoils to those who are able to be at the top of the knowledge economy are going to get actually greater, and it will be fewer people. Yeah. And that's, in essence, that's the disruptive potential to society is I think income inequality and the like will get even more pronounced than it already is. Again, driven largely by the technology and then the nature of work for what we need.
You said it very well. And as I kind of frame it to my students, and that is historically, and when I say historically, I mean coming out of World War II, a generation was taught the wedge in society was sort of, did you have a college degree or not? And that was your ticket to the upper middle class and beyond. And today, I think parents are still subscribed to that because they don't see a better alternative. But understanding that there are plenty of roles that are the doers in the world, if you will, who probably have a brighter economic future than folks who are leaving with, $250,000 in debt and a degree in something that, let's just say, competes with LLMs. And that could be, even something as we thought as safe as computer science or computer programming. Those are at risk. So,
which is, by the way, I think one of the areas where I'm seeing the fastest uptake of these technologies, that I think any computer scientist who doesn't understand and learn how to leverage generative AI in their coding is already behind. So in other words, the traditional way of like, I'm going to generate the code myself, that's already been supplanted by co-development with the AI. And so I think that's a trend that's happening maybe quicker than even some of these other sectors.
Yeah, I mean, I went online myself and just in Python created a little digital assistant for myself that just pulls my Google Calendar, pulls my Gmails, ranks them, summarizes them, generates a response that I can cut and, edit and send back, and then logs it into a spreadsheet that I can then, provide human reinforcement learning on to improve that dialogue. And I'm not a coder, but I have ChatGPT, and through some trial and error, it did work in the end. And that has freed me up. And I know that I feel like it's a little bit of a cliche in the sense that, well, it'll free you up to do, higher order work. But in reality, there is a window to do that. It won't be forever. There is a window. And so to put a coda on this conversation, I actually get this conversation a lot on the side, if you will, when I'm talking to executives and they ask me, yeah, that's great, Jeff, what you tell me about my business, but what about my kids? I mean, we're both fathers. I mean, tell me, how are you looking at this? Maybe not through the lens of a professor, but more through the lens of a father.
Well, and again, this goes back to my point about like I'm not quite subscribed to the jobless future that some worry about. I do think at the end of the day, and I'm borrowing from others who've made this point, what these AI do very well is they make predictions, and they do it incredibly well in any number of different domains. There is still, I believe, this role for human judgment that layers on top of that. And even in the case of autonomy, there is a decision made at some point to give the machines that autonomy. And I'd like to believe that there are a whole host of things that we as humans bring to the table that allow us to add value, if you will, in this world of AI. And I think, what's interesting from an education standpoint, in some ways, I think we're going to need to even more go back to our roots in terms of like the liberal arts, critical thinking. How do we deal with ambiguity and uncertainty? The moral dimensions and the value dimensions that technology presents to us all the time. It's just not clear that AI will ever be a moral engine in any way. Again, the Terminator aside, the idea that the AI will gain consciousness as we know it as humans, I think is at least highly unlikely, despite some believing that it might occur. So the way I've started to articulate it is what AI does very well is it follows whatever objective function we give it. What I think is distinctively human, and I worry that the neuroscientists might tell us otherwise, is that we have choice in our objective function. And that's the essence of what we bring to the table. And that's going to continue to be important. So, getting back to your original question of like, what do I tell my kids? I think that higher level investment in critical thinking and the ability to reason, both strategically, but also morally, I think that's going to be our value add. And those places where that is required are going to become even more valued in the economy.
I highly agree. And it was my friend Martine, he's a classmate and friend. He said, when I asked him this question about his kids, he said, fix people, fix animals, or fix robots. He's an engineer, so I give him that space. But you're in your teaching, part of your teaching opportunity is to bring a liberal arts perspective to the MBAs. Yeah. And so I appreciate that you highlight the value of that. Because it's critical. Just because the machine says it doesn't mean we have to follow it. We have to remember we have agency and have free will and have the ability to address what we think are the most important issues.
Well, one of the things we do at the Darden School where I teach is we use almost exclusively Socratic method, case method for our instruction. And what it allows you to do is exactly explore those dimensions, right? At the end of the day, what we're teaching is decision making under uncertainty and ambiguity and incredible complexity. And as I often tell my students, there's rarely a right or wrong answer, but there are certainly better argued answers than others. And that having that ability to convince others of your viewpoint and bring them along to go from some strategic action, that I would argue has always been the case in business, but it is becoming increasingly important in this age of AI.
Well, touching on this idea of case studies, you have a number of case studies in your book. And so I'd like to pivot a little bit and maybe latch on to a few of those. And maybe you could pull an example or two from your book to help walk through a little bit of what is that framework or structure that executives should be considering as they do this. So first, set the stage for us. If a company is considering a digital transformation, what is their current state, if you will? And then we can talk about frameworks for changing along the way.
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, I'm going to evoke something I actually mentioned later in the book, which is this idea of the digital transformation stack. Please. So I identify 4 layers. There's your baseline infrastructure. This is everything from cloud computing and the like to kind of organize your data. The second layer is your data and analytics layer. So this is what do you do with like the data lakes you're building and the like? What dashboards might you create? What higher order, maybe AI analytics you're providing on top of that data? The third layer is the application layer. This is where it really gets real. What are the digital applications you're creating, either externally for your customers, let's say, or internally for your operations, whatever it might be, an HR, recommendation engine or something like that. But the top layer of the stack, not surprising coming from the strategy professor, is your digital strategy. And what I find is that companies will see opportunities in the technology and immediately start running towards them. And so I use the quite frequently the joke that, you hear people say like, we want to be the Google of X. And my response typically is, you're not going to be the Google of X. Google's going to be the Google of X. They're much better positioned than you to achieve that vision and that strategic position. You've got to go back and rethink, like, what are you uniquely bringing to the table that will allow you to have a unique competitive advantage position in the market, and then work your digital strategy there. Because I've run across, dozens of companies who work the stack from the bottom up. The first question they ask is, they go to the IT people and say, should we move to the cloud or not? And then they decide, maybe we need to hire a couple data scientists to help us with this. And maybe they'll then do a pilot where they create an application, never asking the question of, well, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to position? How are we creating value? So the analogy I like to use is the idea of improving the efficiency of the engines on the Titanic. You might run more efficiently, but all you're going to do is hit the iceberg quicker than you would, or more efficiently than you would have otherwise. So where you steer the ship is incredibly important in this digital age. And there's a lot of projects that I think, applications and things that are being developed that at the end of the day really don't meet your strategic vision and position you well. And so it just ends up being a wasted effort. And you hear that frustration. Companies who've made a lot of investments in digital transformation, and they're struggling to see how it's actually created value for them. And again, in many cases, it's because they've worked the stack the wrong way. They've started at the bottom rather than the top.
Such an important point to emphasize. When I talk about strategy in a consulting setting, profitability is not a strategy. And it's easy that when profitability suffers to move to the feasibility or the technology, right? This is why folks look at AI as fairy dust, like it's just going to magically improve things and return them to a desired level of profitability. But to go all the way back to the beginning and understand what's the user-centered need. And that user-centered need doesn't have to be the customer. It can be an internal stakeholder. But as we know from design thinking, what are their pains, gains, jobs to be done? And you talked about, I love that analogy that I will steal that like an artist, but quote my source. We don't.
Jeff, I am pretty sure I'm stealing it from somebody else. So yeah, we're all borrowing from someone before us.
That's right. Well, we're just practicing what Sir Isaac Newton, right? Only because I stand on the shoulders of giants. But if you start at the top and say, this is my strategy, and digital applies to that. I had a customer who was involved in an industry, and their mission was to be, incremental goals to succeed within that industry. And I said, well, what is the most successful company in that industry doing? And they are a digitally led organization. And so that when that company hit antitrust barriers that they couldn't really expand in that core business, they could easily add adjacent industries because they had transitioned from X to a digital provider to that entire ecosystem. They still did X, but expanding allowed them to bring adjacent industries in under that umbrella, which was ultimately logistics, and not just a small sliver of that logistics market. So,
which, by the way, is I think one of the reasons that when I work with companies, they almost all cite big tech companies as new and emergent competitors for them, even if they're in traditional industries that you would not think the Amazons and the Microsofts would be maybe on the surface a threat. Because what's happening is the value of data has become so paramount that the value of the data they sit on is huge, that they can use it to diversify, whether it's into financial services, health care, education. And so it's become a big threat across a lot of industries that maybe these big tech companies are sitting on this data goldmine that they're going to leverage to come into your industry segment.
It was a conversation I had in a previous episode with Cal Lai. He was is the CEO of an online veterinary company and started in 2014 as a call-in service. And he recorded all the phone calls so that when AI hit, he had 2.4 million phone calls to train his agent. And he says, in his words, anyone can have data. The veterinary industry is rife with data. The problem is that it's not information because there's no standardization. My clinic may call a procedure a 1, 2, 3. Your clinic may call it an XYZ. Whereas in human healthcare, because of Medicare reimbursement, everything has a standardized code.
Interesting.
And so the biggest part of his transition is to help individual providers just turn that data into information to be able to benefit from the AI solutions. So I'll put in a shameless plug for folks to go back to Cal's episode because it's just a perfect example of turning data into information. But from your experience, and whether it's a case that you teach in class or some consulting work you've done, what's an example of a company, and I'll let you choose, who's either done this well or maybe made a mistake or two along the way, and what was the outcome there? Can you give us a little bit of your
I'll start with the latter. There's so many ripe examples that we all know of companies that have failed in their digital transformation. I'll highlight two classic ones just because I think they're interesting stories of what went wrong. So one of the classic ones is Kodak. And on the surface, it seems like the simplest digital transformation failure. As you can imagine, they make film, the world goes to digital imaging, they go bankrupt. But what's fascinating about the Kodak story is that going back to the 1970s, they saw the potential of digital imaging and started to invest in it, billions of dollars. They had some of the first patents on digital imaging, one of the first digital cameras on the market. They hired a tech CEO away from Motorola. Like, they had done arguably everything to make this transition, and they still failed. And I think there's a couple lessons to be learned from that story. One is the changes in the fundamental architecture of the industry and the fundamental business model. What really did them in at the end is that they assumed at the very last moment that we would take all these wonderful digital images and then print them out. And so when Facebook and social media took off, the idea that we would no longer do that and we would just share images digitally online wasn't foreseen and ended up really being the final nail in the coffin. The other problem they ran into is just the fundamental capability difference between being a film company to a digital company. As I like to say, if you have a PhD in chemistry, you're probably not becoming a digital expert. And they had a lot of PhDs in chemistry who were excellent in that old film business, who did not see a future for themselves in the digital business. So there was a change management challenge that they just could not overcome. And so as a result, it's not uncommon for companies facing these types of headwinds to really struggle to make the transition. If anything, I can probably think of more examples of failure than success.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because the statistics do play that out, though, that the majority of digital transformations fail to return their desired outcomes, and we can always take our own spin on that. Is it because that it wasn't scoped correctly? Were there technological challenges within the implementation? But those are solvable. The challenge is that after piece. And I think the sticker shock of parts 1 and 2, scoping and implementation, the perception is that either it leaves little budget or additional budget isn't allocated for the change management piece. And what you said is exactly right. I mean, my strategy professor in business school made the same point you did, and that is that they were a chemical company. So, as you said, a chemical company is not going to become a digital company. And it's no shock that other chemical companies have either merged or faced similar profitability challenges or going concern challenges as this digital transition.
Though to give a counter in the same space is Fuji. So Fuji was their primary competitor in the film business, had made great success and inroads into Kodak's business in the 1990s. They looked at the problem differently. Rather than viewing themselves as an imaging company, they looked at those core capabilities and said, actually, we do have a set of capabilities here that could translate into other industries. And so what they did is, rather than stick with the B2C market, they moved to the B2B market, in particular in the healthcare space and some other spaces that allowed them to use some of that core technology that they had to succeed and actually thrive as a completely different company than they were, back in the 1990s, where they were a consumer B2C film selling company. So it is possible to make these transitions, but it gets back to what we call the strategist challenge. This idea that, you need to identify valuable competitive positions at the intersection of your mission and values as an organization. That's your North Star. The opportunities the market provides, including the technology and what competition is doing. And then ultimately the capabilities you possess now, or at the very least could develop in the future. And that's the crux of it. That's where I think a lot of companies struggle, is they see the opportunity set, but how do we transform our current capabilities to match that moment? I'll give you another example. I've done some work with a couple of different service-oriented companies whose model is predicated on having basically feet on the ground in virtually every community in the United States.
Sure.
Very place-based brick and mortar type of strategy.
Yeah, very classic saturation model.
Exactly. And they face the challenge of digital native companies coming into the marketplace with no physical footprint, who are just using online sales channels and online modules to basically do the same work. The challenge for a company like that is if you just say, let's get rid of the old model and become a digital native company ourselves, you're most likely going to fail, right? You're just not going to be able to compete with these companies that have started as digitally native companies. So you need to take a look at, all right, well, what is it core that we do that we can now lever with technology and add value, but maybe not walk away completely from that model that we have. And that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of service-oriented organizations, how to think about this exchange. Here at the Darden School, we've thought a lot about this, where there is opportunities in online education, where some of our peer schools have gone out and built massive, online MBA programs. We early decided, that's not who we are. That we will fail if that's what we're trying to do. We still have to digitally transform. We still have to leverage the technology to add value in the ways that we engage the world. But we're not going to just kind of get rid of what we do in our residential-based education and become a pure online player, because we just won't be the ones who will win that world.
Yeah, it goes back to research that I frequently cite in my class, and this is from 2000, called the Unbundled Corporation. And it was some partners at McKinsey, and basically laid out threefold. A company can either be economies of scale, economies of scope, or an innovative company. And a school like Darden that has a top credentialed residential program, that's an economies of scope. You're delivering value through the brand, and to try and transform into that scale company to capture more of that tail, although enticing, I think the surface level argument is the risk to the brand, and that's true, but it's also the student experience. And there, you can't find 10 more Mike Lennox to scale. And even Mike Lennox 10 times on video is not going to be as effective as that residential program.
No, and I've long been saying, and I think we will see it, though it takes decades to play out here, probably, of a disruption in higher ed, where, as I like to say, we haven't had available to us before the Toyota position, where it's a quality education at a low price at scale. If you think about market share, none of our universities have even single-digit market share in higher ed, right? We all are very small players. And I think that will continue, that there will be a set of elite residential universities who have highly selective and provide you that robust, residential experience. But somewhere in the pecking order, and I don't know where the line is, but, pick your favorite number, maybe it's the 50th ranked school or the like. That value proposition isn't strong enough to offset the low cost quality online education that you can have. And I think we're already seeing that the kind of middle ranks are being decimated. And your choices are either try to play the online scale game, which some schools are trying to do, or desperately try to move up the rankings to be one of those elite selective residential universities. But being kind of stuck in the middle there is not an attractive place. And we see programs left and right who are struggling to stay open and are losing students, and the financial model doesn't work. The only thing I think saving higher ed is that we aren't the most nimble of industries, and there's no active exit market for universities and for colleges. And so it will take a long time to play out here. It's not as fluid as the business world tends to be.
And a shameless plug to go back to an earlier episode I interviewed the CFO of Campus, and they're an online university, and they're taking that longer tail through a solely online approach. Although they own an accredited university to administer the degrees, they're taking that flip side approach and capturing that long tail. But it's played out here locally in the Bay Area. Mills College, which was a famous all-women's school here, and they were acquired by Northeastern University because they went bankrupt. And even Northeastern, to that extent, is still having difficulty using their brand to raise that physical location to the next level. So it's not without its challenges. And this is not limited to higher education, of course. Just in the last little bit of time that we have, if we can just take your model, and what is a company where maybe you don't have direct insight, but you might ask your students of how is this digital transformation that has a digital transformation opportunity, but perhaps hasn't taken advantage of it? Or are there industries where you see opportunities that if I'm a disruptor, I could maybe I guess the example I use is back in the day, you'd buy a physical business, improve its financials, right? And that was your exit strategy. And now I would argue the opportunity is to go in and digitally transform businesses to add value, to exit them. Tell me if you see something in the universe that might play to that thesis.
No, I think you're seeing that everywhere. I mean, I quite literally. I mean, I half joke that I have yet to run into a company or an industry that isn't feeling the pressures of digital transformation, and ultimately it's evil twin digital disruption. And it is that pervasive. You think about old line industries that we might not think of as being very digitally enabled. Something like coal mining. Coal mining is largely automated at this point. There are not people going down with pickaxes into a tunnel. A coal miner today sits in a control tower, probably has an advanced engineering degree, and is controlling a bunch of robotics who are doing the work there. So even these old line industries that we have this, maybe glorified image of, working with your hands are less and less true. So I think, what I try to do in the book is provide a set of frameworks for thinking through the issues here. And many of these are pretty standard strategy frameworks in general, with some important nuance to it. Again, always asking the question of data. What is the role of data, and how can data add value to your services? Like I said, either clients or your operations or however you're structured. Understanding the industry lifecycle, I think, is really important. Where are you in the degree of disruption within your industry? What is happening? Is it still early, heady days, or is it a more mature period here? Just like we were saying with generative AI, like where are you in that S curve? Right. Where are you individually as a company matters. Are you one of these digitally native startups that's trying to keep yourself alive and scale versus a mature competitor who has all of these legacy costs that you're dealing with? Not surprisingly, those two companies should have very different strategies about how they want to position themselves in the world. And again, while that seems so obvious, it's amazing, again, how many companies and organizations I run into who just see like, oh, there's a cool opportunity here to be a scale player, leveraging network externalities and be a platform, but not asking the harder question of, well, does that position make sense for us and who we are and what we bring to the table? And that's the heart of strategy, right? It's differential competitive positioning based on the assets that you have and the opportunities before you, and making the hard choices. Another wise person, who I'm not sure who originally said this, said, strategy is as much about what you're not going to do as it is what you are going to do. And I think while many executives understand that fundamentally, whenever it comes to digital, it's kind of like, let's grab the shiny new toy as quickly as possible, without being reflective about, well, to what ends, don't just run out and start, creating generative AI applications. Like, what are you trying to do in terms of positioning your company? Think through, what is this technology going to do to competition? Who's it going to bring in? How are they going to restructure markets? Talk quite a bit in the book about new business models that are arising left and right in our digital age, whether it's old models like advertising. I always point out, the big tech companies all have very different business models, right? Apple's trying to sell you a product. They make most of their money off of iPhone sales. Google and Facebook or Meta, they're selling advertising, right? Like, as the old joke goes, we're not our customers, we're their product at the end of the day. Amazon, they've got this huge online marketplace and they're selling stuff, but they're then using data to be able to do so in an effective way. So each company has a very different way they're monetizing the offerings that they have, even if fundamentally they're all about data and value-added services that they leverage that data for.
Well said, Mike. And I have to think, if I'm an executive and looking at what am I going to spend any free time thinking about over the summer months, I would definitely drill in on that last comment you made, is what is the role of data in my business, but also my industry? What value can it add? And do I have the raw ingredients to deliver that value? If I do, how do I make sure it's accessible to an artificial intelligence? And if I don't, how do I acquire that data? Whether it's changing my internal processes to make sure that I'm capturing clean data, or do I need to go acquire that in the market? I think that's a fundamental question executives need to ask. And your book is a great starting point with an incredible framework to guide them through that process.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Mike, I will certainly link to your book in the chat, but where else can folks keep up with what you're thinking about on a regular basis?
Yeah, I would recommend going to my website, which is just michaellenox, Lenox.com. And I have, lots of information in there about some of the online courses I have. I have my own podcast called Good Disruption, where we tackle different technologies. And of course, my various books and the like that are out there in the world.
A one-man media empire. So, I've excellent podcast and can't recommend it enough, especially for folks with a strategy bent. So, Mike, with that, thank you so much. Have a great one.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.